Fine wine is produced all over the state of California. From as far south as Los Angeles, where some of the very first vineyards were planted by Spanish missionaries, all the way up through Santa Barbara County, into Paso Robles, up through the Central Coast, into Sonoma County, and then as far north as Mendocino and Lake County, you can find fantastic wines all over the state of California. But how is it that one small little valley, just 50 miles north of San Francisco and 30 miles long, has achieved such an incredible cachet and status about it? Yes, we're talking about Napa Valley. Napa Valley is blessed with incredible weather. They have absolutely perfect Mediterranean climate for producing high quality grapes. They also have an incredible diversity of soils in the valley. Their proximity to San Francisco also has led to their success, but these factors alone don't tell the whole story. And I think, as we usually do, I think you have to look back at the history of a region to really understand how Napa got to where it is today. Wild native vines grew in Napa Valley well before any European settler ever stepped foot in Napa Valley. But in 1839, a gentleman named George Yount actually immigrated from North Carolina across the country, was given a land grant, and planted what is recognized as the first vineyard in Napa Valley in a place called Yountville, of all things. Imagine, George Yount, he goes to Yountville. No, of course, Yountville was named after George Yount after the fact. About 10 years later, something else pivotal happened to Napa Valley, and that was the California Gold Rush. And what the Gold Rush did was it brought literally hundreds of thousands of people across the country to California in search of gold. Of course, most of them did not discover gold or strike it rich on gold, but many of the people that took this trek across the United States were European settlers who had a taste for wine in their culture already. So there was a demand for wine. In 1861, Charles Krug was credited with opening the first commercial winery in Napa Valley. His winery was so successful that in the coming years, a slew of wineries opened up. So now in the 1880s, Napa Valley's wine industry is booming. It's actually booming almost too much because so many wineries opened up, there was a surplus of grapes, and grape prices plummeted a bit, but this was the least of their problems. In 1890, the Phylloxera Plague struck Napa Valley. What is Phylloxera? Well, Phylloxera is this nasty little vine louse that lives in the soil and kills vines. It took winemakers years to figure out how to solve the Phylloxera plague. Basically, they figured out that if they grafted European vines onto American rootstock, the vine louse, Phylloxera, doesn't eat the American rootstocks that were growing there previously. Voila, Phylloxera is solved. But then things got even worse.
Even worse?
In 1920, Prohibition took effect. And Prohibition essentially outlawed the sale, consumption, or production of any alcoholic beverage, including wine. Before 1919, there were 2,500 wineries in operation throughout California, a lot of them in Napa. By 1933, when Prohibition finally ended, there were less than 100. And those that survived were only surviving on a shoestring to make sacramental wine. Whenever we're talking about the history of an area, there's always a couple of really key influential players. One of those gentlemen is André Tchelistcheff. André Tchelistcheff was a Russian-born winemaker who was making wine in France. And the owner of Bullier Vineyards, Georges de Latour, went to France looking for a winemaker to restart his winery. Tchelistcheff came back, agreed to be the winemaker at Beaulieu Vineyards, and he was nothing short of transformational in what he brought to Napa Valley. He brought back techniques that hadn't been used in Napa before. Things like temperature-controlled fermentation, the use of oak barrels. Basically, he brought chemistry and cleanliness to the wineries. Another very influential player in Napa Valley's wine scene was a name that we're all familiar with, and that is Robert Mondavi. And Robert Mondavi and his family actually purchased the Charles Krug winery back in the 1940s. And Robert and his brother Peter were running the winery. Robert had a much greater vision for Napa Valley, and he famously had a knockdown, drag-out fist fight with his brother. They separated, and in 1966, Robert Mondavi opened the first winery after Prohibition in the Napa Valley. Mondavi was a great winemaker, but more than that, he was a brilliant marketer and really had a vision for Napa Valley that said Napa can make wine that rivals any in the world. If any single event can be credited with putting Napa Valley on the world stage, it was the 1976 Tasting of Paris. What was the Tasting of Paris? Well, the Tasting of Paris was an idea that was thought up by a gentleman named Steve Spurrier. Steve Spurrier was an Englishman living in Paris, and he had a wine school. So he thought this would be a good way to promote his wine school, and it would also be a fun way to celebrate the bicentennial here in the United States. So he decided to put the very best Cabernet and Chardonnays of France against the best wines that California produced in a blind tasting. It was held in the International Continental Hotel in Paris. It was a bunch of judges. They were all French sommeliers from some of the very best restaurants in Paris and French wine writers. So they have this blind comparative tasting, and the unexpected happens. The wine that wins the best Chardonnay competition is Chateau Montelena Chardonnay from Napa Valley. The wine that wins the best Cabernet was Stag's Leap Wine Cellars Napa Valley Cabernet. Napa Valley would never be the same after this. Today, Napa Valley is home to over 550 wineries. Some of the most prestigious and sought after and expensive wines in the world come from Napa Valley. But not all Napa Valley wine has to be expensive. One of my favorite Cabernets that I've been drinking recently is Jackie Cabernet. Jackie Cabernet comes from the Oak Knoll district. The wine itself is fantastic, rich, full-bodied Napa Cabernet for a very affordable price. And Napa is not all just Cabernet. They produce fantastic Chardonnay and really good Sauvignon Blanc as well. One of my favorite Sauvignon Blancs right now is the Gibb family Sauvignon Blanc. Gibbs is a really interesting story. Mr. Gibbs purchased this land back in the 1950s. They just started making wine about 20 years ago, which is why the Gibbs family wines, both Cabernet, Chardonnay, and Sauvignon Blanc, are delicious and fantastic values. Check out a bottle of Gibbs Sauvignon Blanc. Now that you know a little more about the history of Napa Valley and how it acquired its fame and fortune, come visit us at one of our stores and check out our fantastic selection of Napa Valley wines, or visit us at abcfws.com and check out some of our other videos.